Bueno, pues ahora que ya hemos hablado un poco de qué son las zonas de bajas emisiones.
Now we've talked about LEZs and the guidelines proposed by the ministry and a number of delegations. And now that we've talked about atmospheric pollution and health, we'll be discussing how LEZs can positively affect the fight against climate change. It will be 3 presentations. The first one by Fernando Valladares, a researcher at CSIC. Second one from Margarita Mediavilla, PhD in physics and a researcher at GEEDS and the University of Valladolid. And finally, Carlos Bravo from Transport and Environment, whom you met a little earlier today. Thank you.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Good evening. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Without further ado, let's go ahead with the presentation. Let me share my screen first. I will only be a minute. Can you see my screen? I think you can. Let me go full screen here. Okay. Not hearing anything, so I suppose you can clearly see my presentation. Today, I'll be giving you an overview of the interactions between environment, climate change, health, just a few very concise ideas to expand upon some concepts that we've already talked about. Let me start off by reminding you that global warming is here. And cities know this. Cities can feel it. Cities, in particular Spanish cities, are hotter than surrounding areas. In Spanish cities, temperature has increased twofold compared to their surroundings. The temperature rises above 35 degrees indoors during the summer and at 35 degrees with humidity over 95%, the human body dies. It leads to death. In dry areas, however, like the Iberian Peninsula, these new temperatures brought about by climate change, thankfully, aren't that harmful, but there are other areas in the planet where that's not the case. And the consequences of global warming in certain areas where humidity is quite high, even at 32 degrees, could be dire. For example, at 32 degrees with high humidity, the United States Army forbids its employees to train outdoors. This is a consequence of climate change, of course, but it's also brought about by atmospheric pollution, which accounts for 12% of total deaths in the world. It's the 4th cause of death in the world. And it's not a matter of technology. People seem to believe that the more technologically advanced we become, the more we pollute. But that's not the case, and it's been demonstrated. Technology, in fact, can help offset our environmental footprint. In Europe, pollution kills thousands of people. In Italy, there are about 91,000 premature deaths a year, 86,000 in Germany. In Spain, about 30,000. That's the estimate, but the figure is probably higher. We can talk about causes of death all we want, and pollution is always going to be there. But there are also some positive remarks to make here. A recent article in fact, show that if we apply the necessary measures to comply with the Treaty of Paris by 2040, we will have prevented 6.4 deaths thanks to a dietary change, 2.5 million deaths thanks to active mobility, and 1.6 million deaths thanks to this reduction in atmospheric pollution. And this should make yet another incentive to working towards achieving the Paris goals. Now, our large cities, developed countries, do have low emission zones. In Madrid, at its inception, the low emission zone was quite small. It was inadequate to the size of the city. But then it became bigger and bigger. As a matter of fact, a number of fines that had been issued by the EU were written off because central Madrid low emissions, the central Madrid low emissions zone actually became more effective over the years, more effective in terms of reducing the concentration of nitrogen dioxide in the air and reducing the percentage of contaminants in the air. So central Madrid is, or used to be, a quite good thing. To give you a few figures, central Madrid has been estimated to save the lives of about 500 people a year. That's the equivalent of a fatal airplane accident, a Boeing 747 crashing. It's a huge impact. However, if at first, thanks to scientific evidence, the local administration voted up this low emission zone in central Madrid, judges overturned that decision, but we'll see how this ends. Anyway, nowadays, about 80% of cancers in children are caused by environmental factors. But even more importantly, perhaps, we have shown that a reduction in pollution in the so-called reversed experiments can bring about wonderful consequences. In China, shortly before the Olympic Games, babies, after the reduction in pollution in China just before the Olympic Games, children on average were born 24 grams heavier, and a few years later, after coronavirus, it was estimated that the pandemic, in fact, due to this reduction in pollution it brought about with its lockdown, saved the lives of over 4,000 children and 17,000 adults. The lockdown was a massive experiment in terms of changes in mobility. And here you can see a very powerful image showing how much NO2 emissions were reduced at March 2020 with the onset of the lockdown. Same thing happened in Spain. On the left, the red areas represent high concentrations of nitrogen dioxide. Merely a week later, after the lockdown, the level of pollution decreased significantly, as you can see. Climate change interacts with atmospheric pollution. It's not only a result of it. They feed off of each other. And if we solve the problem of pollution in our cities, we'll also be tackling another problem at the same time, climate change. More and more people live in cities nowadays, and that's why it's so important to reflect upon pollution, and that's why we need to strive to reduce emissions. The interaction between climate change and contaminants is complex, and it can be seen in the case of ozone. Ozone levels are directly affected by the interaction between what we emit and weather conditions. For example, in inland Iberian Peninsula or in Central California, in Greece, temperatures in the summer are so high and there is so little wind that concentrations rise.
Incrementadas en frecuencia por el cambio climático, generan un ozono que se suma al de las emisiones, ¿no?
Interacting with climate change, these conditions increase the emissions of ozone, and the ozone, in turn, increases global warming. Let me illustrate further instances of interaction. COVID-19, the pandemic, is strongly related to pollution. In the early months of last year, the risk of death due to COVID would increase by 15% per microgram of contaminants in the air. The expansion of COVID across the world was actually facilitated by COVID because particles would spread more easily as another important epidemiological parameter would rise. This parameter is called the number of people that an infected subjects can in turn infect. But we can also talk about interactions between COVID and climate change. There's a lot to say here, and it's actually us who are affected by our health, as are our ecosystems. Green spaces, especially if built by man, even when built by man, reduce human mortality. A study published in 2019 showed that by being close to a green patch, life expectancy could increase by up to 15 years in cities. But there are also interesting studies, such as this one that was done in 2019, that showed that the more green patches there are in cities, the lower the risk of incurring in diseases and mental disorders, schizophrenia, anorexia, bipolar disorders, stress, diabetes. If as a teenager you've spent a lot of time around trees, both in urban centers and in the open country, the risk of contracting these diseases as an adult decreases. Actually, some very specific areas of our brain benefit from living in a closer green patch, because our brains feed off of a healthy urban ecosystem. We keep talking about the brain. These 2.5 particles, suspended particles, are so small that they can push through lung membranes and reach blood vessels, and they can travel around the body. They can be carried by the bloodstream around the body. Another surprise, virus particles, as well as small aerosols, can reach the brain directly through the nose. They don't need to be carried to the bloodstream first. And when they reach the brain, they inflame it, and they can even cause tumors. We know, however, that trees and plants in general act as a barrier from pollution, but also from atmospheric pollution as well as noise pollution. Data shows that in the US, trees save the lives of 250 people a year in cities, 850, and they can decrease the morbidity of acute respiratory distress quite significantly. They can absorb much of the impact that's brought about by human activity in general. So how are we doing right now? There are lots of stats in this regard, but let me quote an article. We're not doing very well, but we are doing quite a few things. It's a sort of glass half empty, half full situation. A study that was carried out last year showed that over half of the cities that subscribed to the Mayor's Pact in the European Union are striving to achieve their reduction goals. All these cities, most of these cities actually, are on track. The blue dots on the map that you can see on screen are on track to achieving their goals. The white dots have been graded as insufficient, but even the red dots aren't doing too badly. They're still doing something. Regarding how emissions are reduced, that depends on the city, on the country, on the local agenda. Central Madrid, for example, is a different tool to those adopted in other cities, because each city has different issues that it needs to tackle. This reduction in emissions is generally achieved through the implementation of energy efficiency programs, switching to renewable energies. Anyway, to give you an overview, diseases, climate change, global warming, pollution, all in. The solution lies in a complex human ecosystem, an ecosystem where we need more green spaces that need to be connected to their surroundings, so as to enable animals and plants to interact with other elements of the system in a functional manner. A further important point: low emission zones need to be expanded as much as possible. If we tackle pollution, we tackle climate change. And if we tackle climate change, we tackle pollution. All of this has very positive repercussions, as I've tried to show you, on our mental and physical fitness. What's at stake here is the health of humans, plants, animals across the planet, and we need an integrated, holistic vision. That was all from me. Thank you very much for listening and for giving me this wonderful opportunity. I'll be very, very happy to take your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we'll listen to Margarita. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. I would like to talk about the work we've done at the University of Valladolid at GEEDS on transport and climate change. So can you see my presentation? I'd like to present some results from the studies that my group carried out, a group focused on energy, economics, and system dynamics. We talk about a Medea model. That means we gather energy, climate change, economics, and we see all the interactions between the different aspects I mentioned. we've been focusing on emissions coming from transport. So there you go. We've got these two articles on which I based my work. I've worked in the transport sector for several years, and this is the result of several years of work. Then we drafted a second article together with a student who was analyzing in a more detailed way the energies in the case of electric vehicles and vehicles based on minerals. So sometimes we talk about energy transition. We see that we are running out of petrol. We see that biofuels should stay in the ground because they also contribute to climate change. You here at this panel are quite aware of that, but the replacement is not easy at all. If we try to replace conventional cars with biofuels, we see that the result is a disaster because there's a grabbing of land, which is very considerable. It takes a lot of land to do that. And the return rate is not good enough. Electric vehicles allow us to save some energy. They consume 33% less energy in net terms, but that's not a lot. And they still depend quite a lot on petrol anyway. I was talking about hybrid vehicles, sorry. Regarding the electric vehicle, yes, we've got a more important saving, 66% less consumption of energy, but they are highly dependent on minerals. And the problem with minerals is very important, and as we will see with some details I'll give you, not just because of the minerals themselves, but because of the impact of the mining sector. However, electric vehicles are relatively efficient. Let's think about solar panels or windmills and the energy they produce. And if we take this energy into the car, then the efficiency is almost 70% in the relation between electricity and will. So we see that the electric vehicle is much more efficient than biofuel-based vehicles. What about hydrogen? And then we have 26% efficiency. And regarding fuels derived from methane coming from hydrogen as well, we attain an even lower efficiency. So we see that we need to replace petrol, but we spot quite a few technical problems in that process that are quite difficult to solve. That's quite difficult for, that's very important for heavy vehicles as well. So we see our limitations in this respect. Let's see what happens if we try to decarbonize transport by 2050. So we try to think about different decarbonization scenarios in the transport sector and see what happens. Here you've got the global emissions, the black line, until 2017, more or less, 2018. And then here we will have the goals of decarbonization from here to 2050. So you see an upward trend, which was quite considerable. We have the 2009 crisis, and now our goal is to reduce the figures. And this is complicated, right? How should we do this? So we've got three scenarios. First, in yellow, we would follow the trend. What would happen if we follow the current trend with electric vehicles, the increase of efficiency. Then the green scenario, the second scenario, based on the electric vehicle, a four-wheel vehicle with an average weight similar to the current conventional vehicle. And then the third scenario with e-bikes, many e-bikes in cities, electric bicycles replacing rapidly all of human transport, all of urban transport, and then light vehicles for inter-urban transport between towns and cities. So let's be aware that we'll have a peak related to petrol. That means that fossil fuel energies are not endless. So we'll reach a point, a peak, when petrol will stagnate and consumption of petrol as well. And then we'll start a fall. So we'll follow that trend of use of petrol until 2014. We see the black line, and then from that point on, we've got the different predictions of experts as to the use of petrol due to problems with extraction that would also determine that peak in petrol use. So let's see what happens with our vehicles. So we've suggested several things for scenario 3, namely current trends. We would have private vehicles carrying persons, almost 40% being electric cars by 2050. Right now, that percentage is about 3%, let's say, I think, more or less, in the case of private vehicles. Well, rather than currently, I would say 3 years ago, because we still lack data from 2021. But back then, most of private vehicles were petrol-based. Then we also have electric motorbikes, and then gasoline motorbikes because of China. And then we will have this other scenario, the trend with the percentage I told you of electric cars, and quite a considerable percentage of gas or gas oil cars, e-motorbikes, and a lower percentage of gasoline motorbikes. Third scenario, with a high percentage of electric vehicles, namely all cars will be electric and all motorbikes will be electric without changing the ratio between motorbikes and cars. And then fourth scenario, with e-bikes, we will have a few electric cars, and even fewer gasoline or gas oil cars, and a majority of electric motorbikes, and a sensible reduction in the use of vehicles. So we would have an e-bike, that would be an electric bicycle. Instead of having a vehicle with 4 wheels, we would have this sort of motorbike with 3 or 2 wheels that are quite light, very light, actually. So what happens? Almost half of the energy consumed for transport is used for goods, for the transport of goods rather than passengers. And those vehicles are much heavier and they are much more difficult to electrify. So currently, today, we've got a certain number of trucks. You can see in green there, then vans in gray, buses, trains, electric trains, and gas oil trains. If we follow our trends, then the percentage of gas oil trucks will stay the same. Then quite a few vans could be electrified. Same would apply to buses that could be electrified almost up to 50% of them. And then for the rest, there would be no change. In the case of the third scenario with electrification of our vehicles, then we would have hybrid trucks, but we didn't dare include 100 or 80% of electric trucks. We didn't think that was realistic. We received lots of criticism, but we still defended that idea that it wasn't realistic to think that a huge percentage of trucks would be electrified, because an electric truck needs to recharge their batteries, to reload their batteries quite frequently and stop very frequently, and then the costs would be quite high. Then buses are 100% electric, and same applies to trains in that third scenario. In the fourth scenario, we would part ways with gas trucks, and there would be quite a lot of electrification for the rest of the vehicles. So let's see what would happen with GDP in global terms. Here we've got the red line for GDP, and then here we have the projections for the future, predictions. So in our model, we see that from 2025 on, we see very considerable restrictions on petrol, so that affects growth, economic growth. So the trends grow less for the trend, but electric bikes go up, and electric vehicles as well. Transport is important when trying to save petrol and still not having a bad impact on the economy if we electrify these vehicles. Then we've got a fourth scenario, a degrowth scenario, and I'll explain what it is in a few seconds. So here in red, we've got historic emissions, and then we've got the three scenarios: the trend-related scenario, electric vehicle scenario, and electric bike scenario. But we see that we still do not approach our objective for the decarbonization of transport, and we're still considering e-bikes, which is something that environmentalists really promote. So we've established a degrowth scenario, which would be the one achieving the goals set. What would we have to do? Well, many radical measures. For example, changing to very light vehicles, as it is the case with e-bikes, with the e-bike scenario. Then GDP should go down and stabilize at $5,000 per capita. The current figure is $6,500. That's quite related to energy, and then would be a relocation, and a big percentage of air transport should be grounded, should stay grounded. We would have to fly less. So these are different projections that we make, playing a little bit with the different factors. That doesn't mean that this is the final solution, it's just an idea. Of course, there would be alternatives. For example, more relocation and less radical descent of GDP, etc. The case is, at the end of the day, we need to go beyond just changing a car for a bicycle in towns and cities, because transport of goods and public transport are very important as well, and they also emit pollutants and are not easy to replace. Regarding minerals, we see that we are also running short of minerals. in our scenarios, we've established that we would double the use of the most important minerals, the rate related to them, the rate of recycling are quite important for electric batteries, but rates are quite low in that respect. And in the case of lithium, we are depleting our reserves, our stocks. Here you've got the 4 different scenarios with the different colors related to the different batteries. There are some batteries that use more lithium, others use less of it. So it depends on which battery we go for. Lithium is used in virtually all technologies related to batteries. And in the case of a high electrification scenario, we will be consuming more and more lithium, and we could run short of it. In the case of e-bike technologies, there would be also quite a considerable number. The same applies to cobalt. Copper as well is quite frequently used for electric motors, but also for the rest of the economy. Here in green is not for electric vehicles, but rather for the rest of the economic sectors, for the rest of the economy. And in certain scenarios, copper would be depleted, and the same applies to nickel. So I've spoken about stocks, reserves. One concept is reserves, namely the sources that are economically viable to use. And then we also have resources, namely all the minerals that we've got in the planet. And some of them, when talking about resources, some are quite critical. Manganese is one example. Lithium is not so critical, but we are still approaching 50% of depletion of use of the whole quantity of lithium that exists in the planet, and that's quite important. So I would like to conclude by saying that it is very important to reduce pollution, to reduce the number of vehicles. Transport is one of the drivers, the key drivers for reducing emissions causing climate change and our dependency on petrol, but we still need to tackle more issues. That was all. I hope I did not go too much into detail. Thank you very much, Margarita. So now we'll pass the floor to Carlos. Carlos, go ahead. Thank you very much, says Carlos. Well, I would like to start by remembering the final sentence by Fernando Valladares, meaning by tackling climate change, we would also tackle the problems related to pollution in cities. I couldn't agree more, because the main cause of global warming and bad air quality is the use of fossil fuels in transport. That's the main problem. We shouldn't forget that 29% of the whole of emissions in Spain of greenhouse gas emissions are due to transport, mainly road transport, which is responsible of 26% of those emissions in Spain. And another important aspect is that a very important percentage takes place within urban areas. Around 10% of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in our country, take place in our cities and towns. So cities and towns have a key role to play in the fight against climate change and in the decarbonization process. There are many ways to act, but acting in that way is fundamental in order to have a more sustainable model, incorporating bicycles, active mobility, green zones, etc. But we shouldn't forget their role when reducing the emission figures within urban areas. And one of the most effective measures in order to tackle all those problems are low emission zones, which is our topic, the topic of our panel right now. So I'll try to focus on the topic of this panel, namely the impact of low emission zones on the fight against climate change. Fernando Valladares also mentioned problems related to health due to polluting particles. But I'll focus mainly on the role that low emission zones can play. This has also been already reflected in the governmental scheme for this. It's a plan, a scheme that needs to be sent to the European Commission for approval, and the Spanish plan was quite positively valued. But the sector, the transport sector in 2017 produced 27% of emissions. We've seen that we already have 29% as a figure for 2019. And the main driving force for the decarbonization of transport and mobility is a modal shift that will affect around 35% of trips that take place within combustion-based vehicles. So for cities of more than 50,000 inhabitants, it is very important to reduce trips with vehicles emitting highly pollutant gases emissions. So we see how cities are very important in order to reduce the national figures. The Climate Change Act incorporated this measure that was in the Spanish plan in Article 14 of the Act. It is stated that it will be compulsory to establish low emission zones for cities of more than 50,000 inhabitants, and also island-based cities, and for towns between 20,000 and 50,000 inhabitants. They will also have to apply restrictions if they violate certain key criteria regarding pollution. Noise is also an issue, and we basically try to reduce emissions. So the Climate Change Act is very good. It affects 49 cities and towns in Spain with more than 50,000 inhabitants, with more than 80% the Spanish population. So if all those cities would pitch in, the change would be quite significant when improving their quality and living conditions of citizens. Of course, we already saw that with COVID. When traffic disappears, we can enjoy seeing and hearing birds. We can enjoy nature. Fernando Valladares already mentioned it. So we need to try to get to that stage without having to have a lockdown because of a pandemic or a similar disease. So the Climate Change Act has that very interesting article. Not just the low emission zones, but other articles and letters of the same section referring to reducing traffic, promoting bicycles. But we think that we could do all this from a holistic approach, not just in isolated measures, and improvement could be quite important in that respect. Reducing emissions of CO2 would be key. In order for a low emission zone to be effective, it needs to follow and respect certain parameters.
Las ha comentado antes su compañero de CODES, pero lo podéis ver en la prensa.
In cities such as Valladolid, Zaragoza, Salamanca, Cuenca, there are some very small low emission zones that allow these cities to comply with existing regulations, but they really achieve little in other terms. However, these cities have stated that they will try instating low emission zones in pedestrian areas as well. They only do that to comply with the law because they're not obliged to do anything more. The law only states that a low emission zones is defined as an area within the territory where continuously access is restricted to vehicles with a view to improving air quality. Okay, so the word continuously can mean a number of things, but that's not enough. It's not good enough. Because, as our vice director said earlier, we need to bring about a model shift, a paradigm shift. And these cities have only instated low emission zones in areas that had already been pedestrianized, which means that there is no reduction in terms of number of cars that circulate throughout the town. So there are some more progressive administrations out there, surely, but this matter can't be left at the discretion of local administration. There has to be a regulation that's properly developed on the basis of Article 14 of the relevant law, because we need minimum requirements. They can be ambitious, why not? We need minimum requirements that will enable us to standardize these low emission zones so as to ensure a consistent application of the law across all Spanish cities. Otherwise, there will be differently sized low emission zones, each with a different scope, and that's simply not good enough. Thanks to low emission zones, CO2 emissions can be cut down by up to 35%. So it's a tool that we need to use effectively and intelligently. So this is what we're advocating for, a regulation that will enable cities and towns to comply with a set of minimum requirements. Some of them might decide to go beyond that, and that's great, but there should at least be some minimum requirements. The law can't tell mayors, of course, where exactly to instate these low emission zones. That needs to be decided on the basis of other criteria. But one thing we do know is that the surface of the LEZ needs to be large enough. There has to be a minimum requirement regarding size, perhaps in terms of percentage as well, because small cities have different issues and requirements from larger cities, but there has to be a minimum requirement so as to discourage citizens to drive their vehicles around the town. We want citizens to opt for alternative means of transport, bikes, so on and so forth. If cities simply do the bare minimum so as to comply with the law, once again, that's simply not good enough. It's not going to bring about sustainable change. So that's something that should be borne in mind. Territory, rigorousness, scope of the law, and sanctions, fines. The vice director earlier told us that all we have right now are guidelines, recommendations, and if you don't comply with them, nothing happens really. We all know this. These are instructions, and surely there's a great intent behind them. But the difference is that these guidelines aren't really mandatory. And as a result, you can't really impose sanctions if they're not complied with. So we have a number of proposals. There has to be a regulation, that's obvious. We need to better define low emission zones, because low emission zones shouldn't only encompass the circulation of cars, they should go beyond that. They should put forward a set of strategies aimed at producing a paradigm shift. That's not only replacing combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles. That's great. It has a great impact on CO2 emissions. It does reduce the percentage of suspended particles in the atmosphere, and that's a great improvement, but we want more. What we want is for cars not to play such a dominant role within cities. We want cities to be quieter, to not be as noisy, and we want people to pick up the habit of walking in town centers. So traffic restrictions, parking restrictions, and how do we achieve that? The only way to achieve that is through a reform from the DGT, the General Directorate for Traffic in Spain. Now, the DGT is not an environmental body. The Ministry for the Environment has the competence to issue regulations regarding air quality protection and traffic restrictions. Also, the DGT, whether this is reasonable or not, last year approved a program aimed at reforming the label system that's been put in place. The plan should have been approved in July this year in order to put a ban on most polluting vehicles, but it hasn't been done. So we need a reform of these labels. The zero label, for example, which is the top label, encompasses not only electric cars, it also comprises, for example, fake hybrids, hybrid cars, and they do pollute. The CO2 parameter should be included in these labels, and they don't do it as of now. Now, depending on the car grading, Euro 5, Euro 6, certain cars enjoy a privileged status, but CO2 is not a factor here. So our proposal is to eliminate the eco label, which is quite deceitful, because the eco label encompasses hybrid SUVs, for example, which are huge cars that do have a combination of an electric engine and a combustion engine. And so they pretty much pollute as much as regular cars. Studies have been conducted in real time on road, and it has been shown that these cars run on their combustion engines a lot more than they do on their electric engines. So they do pollute a lot. And then natural gas vehicles, that's a fossil fuel. A natural gas vehicle emits a number of greenhouse gases, not only CO2. And so aside from having a direct impact on air quality, they also emit fine particles that are inhaled by everyone, even children. They penetrate the bloodstream and they cause inflammation in a number of organs in the human body. Some studies have shown that these particles, on top of everything else, can also cause brain cancer. They can't be considered as eco label. So we proposed eliminating this label and creating a new one for cars that emit less than 92 micrograms of contaminants per kilometer. It could be a bit of an extreme measure, really, but we want to adjust to EU regulations. So within this category, only Euro 6 and Euro 7 vehicles would be permitted, along with electric vehicles. Only these vehicles would fall under this new label, and they're more effective. Surely, what's the problem with that? The problem is that this tool, in order to be used effectively, requires a deeper paradigm shift, because if all types of cars are allowed within the city limits, regardless of their labels, we're going nowhere. A number of cities have thought about restricting access to their town centers, and that's great. But all the criteria we just listed off should be borne in mind when devising a new label system. We need an appropriate, effective label system, one that complies with all the requirements, the criteria we just listed out. In this regard, ANFAC has been carrying out a very powerful campaign aimed at hindering the implementation of this new regulation. So basically, they're trying to force us to keep on inhaling polluted air. That is not acceptable. I don't know how well I'm doing on time, but there are a number of proposals that should be looked into. For example, commodity transport. The European Commission, through the 5045 package, proposed that all models of vehicles and vans produced, manufactured from 2035 onwards be zero emission. That's a great measure because it leads to the decarbonization of vehicles starting in 2035. Vehicles that are sold before that date, of course, would still be allowed to circulate up to a certain date. But some people are even talking about outlawing combustion engine vehicles altogether by 2040. And with the reduced costs deriving from this ban, well, there will be a lot of changes. A number of car manufacturers, in fact, seem to be investing a lot of resources into the new generation of electric vehicles. So that's the future, electric vehicles. But anyway, low emission zones need to ensure that commodity transport is done in compliance with existing regulations and that it doesn't contribute to polluting town centers. At the same time, this regulation should ensure to create hubs so that, for example, if a van, an Amazon van, for example, needs to deliver a number of packages across town, instead of driving around town and dropping them off individually, it could drop off all its parcels at a hub, and then the parcels could be delivered by bicycle manually, individually. And that can be provided for by regulations. All we need is an idea. All we need is to plant the seed. These are our proposals, and we do hope that they will be reflected in the medium term in a royal decree. Public transport services need to become a priority as well. In this regard, it's unacceptable to still keep on purchasing today gas-powered coaches and buses. We need to invest in zero-emission buses and coaches for our public transport system. Public transport is a lot more effective than private vehicles, of course. Carpooling is also more effective than private vehicles. And if we want that to become a reality, we need to provide the right infrastructure, recharge stations, for example, and so on and so forth. Car and bike sharing is also a great system that we should be taking full advantage of. There are several other measures that we have included in our proposal. We need a monitoring surveillance system for this, of course. If we can't fine transgressors, nothing can ever be achieved, because anyone will be able to breach the protected space of low emission zones and not be fined because of it. It's obvious that low emission zones, and this has been demonstrated by studies, are very effective in reducing emissions, atmospheric contaminants, particles, etc. So it's important to take this seriously, push the right regulations, and that's it, really. That's all from me. Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions.
Bueno, yo entiendo que es muy difícil.
I understand it's difficult to highlight the correlation between LEZs and climate change, because there aren't any studies in this regard, to my knowledge at least. But during the pandemic, with the lockdowns, the concentration in parts per million of greenhouse gases went up after the lockdown. So my question for scientists is, how long do we need to achieve a sustainable local reduction in emissions? When will we start measuring CO2 emissions properly on a global level? Are you talking about parts per million of CO2? During the pandemic, CO2 emissions went down. No, that's not the case. data coming from the ministry shows that pollution went up. Is that the concentration? Yes, parts per million. But what I want to know is how long does it take for this reduction in emissions to become detectable by measurement instruments? Are you talking on a global scale? What's clear is that in cities, CO2 emissions decreased. We said earlier that 10% of total CO2 emissions in Spain are accounted for by vehicles. If with low emission zones we can achieve a 25% reduction, that's obviously a great tool, right? Yes, but I think to answer the question, I think that CO2 lingers in the air for about 100 years. Tying this off to what Margot just said, and Carlos as well, I wanted to talk about the PNIEC. This program sets forth another goal, reducing transport emissions by 35% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. So we should see what transport-related emissions were in 1990, 30 years ago, and then reduce current emissions by 35% compared to those levels. If that's the goal, then great. But the scientific community has been looking into this. CO2 emissions linger in the atmosphere for 100 years. And as a result, the concentration of CO2 and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will keep on increases even though emissions decrease. So how can we achieve a full-on drastic reduction? Well, climate change plays a huge role here. CO2 lingers in the atmosphere for 100 years. And so we would need to study a climate model and see how long it takes for this reduction to have a direct repercussions on current level. I can look into it if you like. But climate change, we need to be aware of this, will be done away with. Now, however, we have to suffer the consequences of the damage we've already done. That's something we need to be aware of. There has been a rise in global temperatures. We have to prepare for that. We will have to strive to emit less than ever before. But even though we do start emitting less now, we will notice the positive repercussions of that in a few years from now. Well, yeah, we're already suffering the consequences of climate change now. We'll keep on suffering it in 100 years' time, actually. CO2 lingers for 100 years, methane a little less, but it's 27 times more polluting than CO2. It contributes to global warming 27 times more than CO2. Natural gas is widely used, and that's pretty much methane in transport nowadays, maritime transport, airborne transport. If natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, can still be sold as a transition fuel in this during this paradigm shift. Well, that sounds hopeless to me. It's like trying to help someone go sober, feeding them wine instead of whiskey. That's what we're doing right now with natural gas. How can you possibly think that a fossil fuel is an actual tool to achieve decarbonization? What we're talking about here is decarbonizing cities, reducing CO2 emissions in cities. And that's why we're trying to ascertain whether low emission zones are a good tool or not. And it would seem like current conclusions that we've drawn show that they are. Climate change is a complex issue. A number of factors go into it, but low emission zones are a proper tool. And if they're properly designed, and if they're backed by a strong regulation, they will take effect. Yes, I just wanted to say regarding gas, that it's seen as a replacement fuel because it really replaces petrol and oil, but it's not a solution. Last question, please. We're running out of time.
So what motivated you, Marga, in your different scenarios to include the air sector in a growth scenario, but not hydrogen? In the case of trucks, you didn't include other options, even though you were aware of electrification. And regarding the third pillar, why were you so little ambitious? So I'm talking about aviation, railways, and trucks. So, I mean, you had a scenario with e-bikes, with gas oil. Why wouldn't you pass that to railways or go for decarbonization through hydrogen, for example? Okay, so we didn't consider railways to a higher percentage in order to replace trucks because of failures in our model, because our model is still not ready. I do think that the railway is an electric transport means of transport for goods, the best one actually, but we need very important infrastructure that we still don't have for that. But yes, it's our fault that we didn't consider railways so much. And then regarding airplanes, decarbonizing airplanes is science fiction. An electric airplane could be a little airplane, but a Boeing 307 is not viable by electrical means. So the only thing we can do with aviation is to stop it, to replace it with other things. And then regarding trucks, yes, as Carlos said, but well, this is debatable. We might be wrong, but we think it is very difficult to have purely electric trucks because an electric truck, a conventional truck can go up to 800 kilometers without stopping for petrol. But an electric truck needs a whole night in order to recharge the batteries, unless you have very specific batteries requiring huge resources, both within the truck and at the gas station or at the electricity station. So making trucks stop every 4 hours so frequently, to spend so much time recharging the battery, or the battery is so huge as to occupy half of the load of a truck, then that's not viable. That doesn't mean that's impossible, but it's very costly. So road transport is not an option. You need to pay for more working hours, for more trucks. So that wouldn't be a solution. That would be interesting for cities, having a track for 40 kilometer trips, but going from Portugal to Germany on a track, well, we need to rethink transport in another way. And the railway would be very interesting for that, but we didn't work on that, and authorities are not promoting it. Well, we'll call it a day, and we'll start tomorrow again at 9:30 in the morning, and we'll be waiting for you. Thank you very much.